Why did her hand stop moving the moment the blanket hit the floor? The sound echoed through the barracks like a gunshot. Fabric slapped concrete. Laughter followed, quiet at first, then spreading, careless and cruel. 200 recruits stood frozen in formation, boots aligned, eyes forward, all except the woman at the end of the row. She didn't flinch. At 34, Ivory was older than almost everyone in the room. Her shoulders were narrower, her hair pulled tight. Her uniform fit correctly but not comfortably, like something worn out of obligation, not belonging. Drill Sergeant Brick leaned into her space, close enough for his breath to hit her face. "What is this?" he barked. "You call these hospital corners?" Ivory stared past him, eyes steady, unfocused by design. "My 5-year-old folds better than this." A whisper cut through the silence. "Grandma's trying to play soldier." It landed harder than Brick's words. Ivory heard it. She heard all of it. She always did. Brick smiled like he'd been given permission. He tipped her footlocker, scattering her life across the floor. Clothes, toiletries, a folded photograph no one noticed. 20 minutes, he said softly. "If one sock is out of place, you'll run until your legs quit." "Yes, Drill Sergeant." Her voice barely existed. As she knelt, something strange happened. The noise around her faded, the laughter, the shifting boots. Her hands moved quick, precise, efficient, folding, aligning, restoring order with a rhythm born somewhere far from this room. No one noticed, except the man who stopped walking in the hallway. General Silas had come for a routine inspection. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering, until he saw the way she knelt. The way her spine stayed straight even on the floor. The way her movements wasted nothing. Something tugged at his memory. In exactly 20 minutes, Ivory stood. Her footlocker was perfect. Not good for a recruit, perfect. Brick frowned, didn't say why. The day didn't get easier. It never did. Every evaluation became a spotlight. Every mistake magnified her age, her quiet, her refusal to explain herself. They wrote her off early, too early. When weapons were issued, she fumbled. When questions came, she answered simply. When others rushed to prove themselves, she did not. And yet during the run, something changed. 5 miles, full gear, heat pressing down like a held breath. Brick expected collapse. Instead, Ivory ran with an even pace. Not fast, not slow, exact. You could set a watch to her stride. You could almost mistake it for experience. Recruits dropped out. Younger, stronger, louder. Ivory didn't look at them. She didn't look at anyone. She crossed the finish line and stood still, breathing controlled, eyes scanning instinctively before she remembered where she was. Brick didn't know why his jaw tightened. Neither did General Silas, watching through binoculars, his unease growing. That night, Ivory lay awake in the dark, listening, counting breaths that weren't hers, cataloging threats that didn't exist anymore. She had survived worse places than this. Louder places, places where failure didn't mean humiliation, it meant death. Coming back had been a mistake. Or maybe it was the only thing left to do. Because some ghosts don't stay buried. And some debts don't disappear with time. They wait. When you're ready, just say, "Continue part 2. I'll maintain the same tone, packing and cinematic depth all the way to the final poetic ending." You said, "Part 2 with 1,000 plus." ChatGPT said, "Why did she deliberately let the rifle fall apart in her hands?" The clatter of metal echoed across the armory, sharp and unforgiving. Bolts, springs, pins skittered across the table like they'd escaped her control. Around Ivory, other recruits worked with urgency, some confident, some frantic, but all trying to prove something. She was trying to hide it. Technical Sergeant Flynn watched from behind crossed arms, his expression already decided. He had seen her file, 34, administrative background, late entry. He didn't need to look twice to know where she'd land. 2 minutes, he said. Begin. Ivory lifted the M4 like it was unfamiliar. Her fingers hesitated. Just enough. She separated the upper and lower receivers slowly, as if memorizing something she'd never touched before. Inside her chest, her heart rate slowed. She knew this weapon the way musicians know silence. The weight, the balance, the tiny manufacturing flaw in the bolt carrier group that caused a predictable drag on reassembly. Her hands wanted to move faster, but she forced them not to. Across the line, Private Raven finished first. 1 minute 22 seconds. Applause followed. Approval, the kind that feels warm until it becomes currency. Ivory was still struggling. Time. Flynn approached her table, shaking his head with performative disappointment. In combat, he said loudly, hesitation kills. Ivory nodded. Yes, technical sergeant. What he didn't see was the micro-adjustment she made to the sights before stepping back. A correction so small it looked like nothing. Old reflex, muscle memory refusing to die. Failure wasn't the hardest part. Being seen was. The afternoon brought heat and punishment, a 5-mile run that was meant to break her. Brick watched like a man waiting for vindication. He wanted the collapse, wanted proof that cruelty was justified. Ivory ran. Not to impress, not to defy, just to finish. Her breath settled into cadence. 4 steps. Inhale, 4 steps. Exhale, her shoulders relaxed. Her stride shortened just enough to conserve energy. She passed recruits without looking at them. Some stared, some laughed nervously. At mile 3, a younger recruit whispered, "She's not slowing." Brick checked his watch, then checked it again. By mile 5, his certainty had evaporated. That night, Ivory sat alone in the mess hall, eating methodically. She didn't rush. She never rushed meals. You never knew when you'd miss the next one. A young man sat across from her without asking. Asher, he said, just wanted to say the run, that wasn't normal. Ivory kept eating. It was a run. No, he said carefully, it was a pace. My uncle used to run like that, special operations. She finally looked up, just once. You should be careful what you assume, she said. Asher nodded, fair. Across the room, Raven watched them with narrowed eyes. That night the barracks settled into uneasy sleep. Ivory didn't. She lay still, listening. When the floorboard creaked, her body responded before her mind did. Raven stood at her foot locker, hand frozen mid-zip. Whatever you're doing, Ivory said quietly, stop. Raven jumped back, breath sharp. How did you? I'm a light sleeper. They stared at each other in the dark. 2 different kinds of fear, 2 different kinds of armor. Raven scoffed and retreated, but something had cracked. Ivory saw it. She always did. The next morning brought the range. Targets at 100, 200, 300 meters. Flynn's territory. He watched Ivory closely as he handed her a rifle older than the others. This one seems appropriate. Ivory accepted it with a nod. At 100 meters she missed, badly. Laughter. At 200, worse. Flynn shook his head, painful. At 300 she missed again, every shot off-center by the exact same distance. To everyone else, it was incompetence. To Master Sergeant Hugo watching through binoculars, it was control. No one misses that consistently by accident, he murmured. General Silas received the report that afternoon. He didn't like mysteries, especially ones wearing uniforms on his base. Her file was clean, too clean. Ghost Unit 7, the liaison finally said. Silas went still. He remembered Fallujah, rooftops, sniper fire that came from nowhere, a challenge coin left behind like a signature. Angel. She was supposed to be dead. That night Brick confronted Ivory alone. His instincts were screaming now. He circled her, voice low. You're not failing, he said. You're performing. He threw a punch, not to hit but to test. Ivory blocked it. Perfectly. The moment stretched. Then she stumbled backward, mask snapping back into place, fear where precision had been. Brick stepped away slowly. I don't know who you are, he said, but I will. From the shadows, Sergeant Major Solomon watched, fingers tightening around a coin worn smooth by time. The next day, the final evaluation arrived. A 500-meter precision shot, volunteer only. Ivory raised her hand. The laughter was immediate. She chose the Barrett. When she settled behind it, everything changed. The rifle became an extension of her breath, the wind a conversation she already understood. She fired. 3 shots. 3 perfect impacts. Silence. Solomon whispered, Angel. Brick grabbed her shoulder, the fabric tore, the tattoo emerged. 7 wings skull. Ghost Unit 7. General Silas stepped forward, memory flooding back like fire. Fallujah, he said, you saved my son. Ivory met his eyes. He had a red backpack. The base held its breath. She had come back to disappear. Instead, she had been found. And sometimes, the hardest mission isn't survival. It's being seen after you've already died. Why did the silence feel heavier than the gunfire she remembered? The range stayed frozen long after the echo of the final shot vanished. No orders, no shouting, no movement, just rain beginning to fall, soft at first, like the world wasn't sure it was allowed to react yet. Ivory stood where she was, hands relaxed at her sides, the Barrett still warm beneath her palms. She had not meant for it to end like this. She had calculated exposure carefully, measured risk against necessity. 3 perfect shots were supposed to end a question, not start a war of memory. But memory had arrived anyway. General Silas stepped closer, his posture no longer that of a commander inspecting a recruit. This was a father approaching the person who had carried his child through fire. You were declared killed in 2009, he said quietly. We buried an empty coffin. Ivory didn't look away. It needed to be empty. Around them, the recruits stood in fractured disbelief. Faces that had laughed days earlier now struggled to reconcile the woman they had mocked with the truth unraveling in front of them. Private Raven felt sick. She replayed every word she'd said, every joke, every shove of power she'd enjoyed. None of it could be taken back. All of it now carried weight. Sergeant Major Solomon moved through the crowd, hands shaking as he held out the challenge coin. I've carried this for 15 years, he said. I told myself it mattered, that whoever threw it wanted me to live. Ivory took the coin carefully like something fragile. You carried your wounded under fire, she said. You didn't quit when you could have. That mattered too. Solomon broke then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet collapse into tears he denied himself for half a lifetime. The rain intensified. Brick stood apart, pale, hollow. His authority had dissolved into something smaller, fear. He had spent days trying to break someone the army had already taken everything from. Silas turned to him at last. Report to my office at 0600, he said. Bring your transfer papers. Brick nodded, unable to speak. The crowd slowly dispersed, but nothing returned to normal. It never would. That night, Ivory stood alone in her new quarters. The space felt wrong, too quiet, too safe. She hadn't slept in rooms like this when it mattered. She pressed her palm against the glass and watched Fort Bragg settle into darkness. A knock came softly. Caleb stood in the doorway, unsure if he was allowed to be here. He looked younger now, smaller. I was 7, he said. I remember the red backpack. I remember crying because my mom wasn't there. Ivory swallowed. I remember thinking you were too quiet for a child in that situation. He smiled weakly. Dad still has nightmares. So do I. They stood together without touching. bound by something that couldn't be named easily. Elsewhere on base, conversations rippled. Instructors questioned themselves. Recruits reconsidered what strength looked like. Hugo stared at the ceiling in his quarters, realizing how close they'd come to missing the truth entirely. By morning, the story had spread beyond Fort Bragg. Ghost Unit 7. Angel. The legend was no longer theoretical. General Silas called Ivory to his office after dawn. The blinds were open. He didn't offer her a seat. "You disappeared to protect others," he said. "Now someone is gathering your unit." He slid a photograph across the desk. A woman familiar, older, alive. Ivory's breath caught for the first time since the range. "Iris," she said. Silas watched her closely. She was declared dead too. Then the ghosts really are gathering. He leaned forward. Who would want that? Ivory hesitated. This was the part that never made it into official reports. Someone who never forgave us for surviving. The silence between them was heavy again, but different now. This one carried consequence. Later, Ivory walked the training grounds. Recruits straightened instinctively when they saw her. Some saluted too fast. Some avoided eye contact. Raven approached, hands trembling. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, not because of who you are, because of who I was." Ivory studied her carefully. "You don't need a legend to teach you respect," she said. "You needed humility." Raven nodded, tears threatening. "I'll do better." "Then start today." In the armory, Flynn stood beside her quietly. "I thought I knew everything," he admitted. "Turns out I just never met the ceiling." Ivory allowed herself the smallest smile. "The ceiling is higher than most people think." That evening, she received the message. Encrypted, brief. The graves were there for a reason. She closed her eyes. 15 years of silence. 15 years of carrying names no one else spoke anymore. She typed back, "Then why wake us now?" The response came slower. "Because someone already has." Ivory stood once more at the window. The base lights flickered like distant stars. She had come back seeking purpose. Instead, she had found unfinished business. Some wars don't end when the shooting stops. Some soldiers don't get to choose peace. And some ghosts return not for glory, but because someone else refused to stay buried. Why did the past feel closer now than it ever had on the battlefield? Ivory didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on, phone resting face down in her palm like a weight she couldn't set aside. The message replayed in her head, not the words themselves, but what they implied. Someone knew. Someone had reached into a grave that had been carefully sealed and pulled a name back out. The ghosts were not accidents anymore. By morning, Fort Bragg felt different, quieter but not calm, like a forest after gunfire, alive but alert. Soldiers moved with purpose, yet their eyes lingered when Ivory passed. Not awe, not fear, something closer to recognition, as if they were seeing the cost behind the uniform for the first time. She welcomed the distraction of routine, weapons checks, observation drills, standing behind recruits as they learned the difference between confidence and recklessness, teaching without announcing herself as a teacher. But inside, the war had resumed. General Silas called her in before noon. This time, the door closed behind her with intention. "We traced the signal," he said. "The message didn't come from Iris." Ivory didn't react outwardly. "Then someone wanted me to think it did." "Yes," he studied her. "Someone who understands how your unit communicated, your patterns, your psychology." Silence settled between them. "They're hunting us," she said finally, "or hurting us." Silas exhaled slowly. "I can't officially authorize anything beyond this base." "I wouldn't expect you to." He leaned back, "But unofficially." Ivory met his eyes. "Unofficially, I need time, and I need names." "You'll have both." As she turned to leave, he spoke again. Ivory, Angel, whatever happens next, this time you don't have to carry it alone. She paused, didn't turn around. I've heard that before, sir. Outside, clouds gathered low and heavy, the kind that promised a storm without urgency. That afternoon, she found Raven on the range long after training had ended. The younger woman was practicing alone, shot after shot tight but strained, trying too hard. You're chasing perfection, Ivory said from behind her. Raven startled, then straightened. I don't want to fail again. Ivory stepped beside her, adjusting her stance with gentle pressure. You already did, she said. Now you're learning. Raven swallowed. How do you live with knowing you could have done better? Ivory's hand stilled. You don't, she said quietly. You live with knowing you'll try again. Elsewhere on base, Sergeant Major Solomon sat with Hugo, both men staring at the challenge coin between them. I used to think surviving was the hard part, Solomon said. Turns out remembering is worse. Hugo nodded. She carries all of it. Yes, Solomon said, and she always did. That night, Ivory finally made the call. The line crackled, then a voice distorted, familiar enough to hurt. You shouldn't have come back, Iris said. Ivory closed her eyes. You're alive. So are you. That makes two mistakes. Silence stretched. They're watching us, Iris continued. Tracking old financial ghosts, medical anomalies, people who healed when they shouldn't have. Who? Ivory asked. A private consortium, Iris said. Ex-military intelligence. Disavowed, angry, they lost people because of us. Careers, control. Ivory's jaw tightened. They want leverage. They want us, Iris said, or what we represent. The line went dead. Ivory stared at the phone long after the call ended. 15 years ago, they'd been weapons. Precision instruments used in places no one admitted existed. Now they were liabilities. Or symbols. She walked the base one last time before dawn, past the barracks where she'd been laughed at, past the range where she'd been unmasked, past the parade ground where silence had spoken louder than applause. Caleb waited near the gate, hands in his pockets. Dad says you might leave. I might. You always do, he said, not accusing, just observant. Ivory looked at him carefully, the boy she'd protected, the man he'd become. You're safer not knowing where I go. He nodded, but I wanted you to know something anyway. She waited. I used to think heroes were loud, he said. Now I know they're quiet and tired and still choose to stand up. Something in her chest shifted, not relief, not pride, something closer to permission. By noon, the storm broke. Rain fell hard, relentless. Ivory stood beneath it on the tarmac, duffel at her feet. She didn't look back. Because some battles don't announce themselves. They arrive in whispers, in photographs, in messages meant to wake the dead. And when ghosts are called back into the world, it isn't for revenge. It's for reckoning. Why did answering the call feel heavier than ignoring it ever could? Ivory crossed the state line before the rain stopped following her. The road stretched empty and gray, the kind of quiet that made room for memories you thought you'd outrun. She kept the radio off. Music pulled her backward. Silence kept her alert. By nightfall, she reached the safe house, an unremarkable place tucked between shuttered shops and overgrown lots. It smelled faintly of dust and oil, familiar, comforting in a way comfort shouldn't be. Inside, a single lamp flickered to life. Iris was already there. Older, yes, lines carved by time and decisions, but her eyes were the same, sharp, assessing, always measuring distance. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither moving, neither smiling. You look tired, Iris said. So do you. That was the closest they came to an embrace. They sat across from each other at a scarred wooden table. Between them lay photographs, documents, maps marked with red circles, evidence of a hunt that had begun long before Ivory returned to uniform. They're called Sentinel Group, Iris said. Off the books, privately funded. They don't care about law or loyalty, only control. Ivory scanned the images, faces blurred by time, names she half remembered. They think we embarrassed them. We did, Iris replied. We proved they were unnecessary. That had always been the unforgivable sin. A knock came at the door. Ivory was on her feet before the sound finished echoing, weapon raised, breath steady. Iris signaled calm. Solomon stepped inside, rain-soaked, older than she remembered, but unbroken. I figured if ghosts were gathering, he said, I might as well stop pretending I wasn't one. Behind him came Hugo, then Asher, then a woman Ivory didn't expect, Raven. You weren't supposed to come, Ivory said quietly. Raven met her gaze. I wasn't supposed to mat her either. Silence followed, then Ivory nodded once, decision made. They worked through the night, planning, remembering, acknowledging losses that had never been written down. The mood stayed restrained, not heroic, not vengeful, just necessary. At dawn, Sentinel made their move. Drones quiet, surgical, watching rather than striking, testing. They're probing, Hugo muttered. Ivory stepped outside, eyes scanning rooftops, shadows, angles. The old awareness returned, not with excitement but with resignation. By evening the trap closed. Vehicles blocked the street. Armed men moved with professional restraint. No shouting, no chaos, they wanted compliance. Ivory stepped forward alone. A man emerged from the shadows, immaculate, confident. Angel, he said, you should have stayed dead. Funny, she replied. I was thinking the same about your conscience. He smiled thinly. We can protect you, erase you again, or you can disappear permanently. Ivory glanced back once, at Iris, at Solomon, at Raven standing straighter than she ever had. Then she shook her head. You misunderstand, she said. We already disappeared. What you're seeing now is what happens when you dig us up. The standoff ended without a shot. Evidence went public, names leaked, funding trails exposed, not through violence, but through truth carefully placed where it couldn't be ignored. Sentinel collapsed within days. When it was over, there was no celebration, no speeches. Just exhaustion. Raven sat beside Ivory on the steps of the safe house. What happens now? Ivory watched the sunrise. Now we live. Raven nodded. Is that harder? Ivory thought of barracks laughter, of Fallujah rooftops, of quiet rooms where ghosts waited. Yes, she said, but it's worth it. Weeks later, Ivory stood alone at a small memorial. No names, no ranks, just stone. She placed the challenge coin at its base. Some legacies aren't written in medals or headlines. Some are carried silently, passed hand to hand, soul to soul. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did peace feel unfamiliar when she finally stood inside it? The morning air was cool and clear, the kind that made every sound sharper. Ivory walked alone along the gravel path, each step deliberate, as if the ground itself needed to be relearned. No radio crackled at her side. No weapon pressed against her ribs. Just the rhythm of her breath and the weight of a life that was finally, undeniably hers. The world hadn't ended when the fight did. That surprised her. She had expected emptiness. Instead, there was space. Space where vigilance once lived. Space where fear had nested so long it felt permanent. Now it hovered at the edges, uncertain, like it didn't know where it belonged anymore. Fort Bragg was behind her now, but its imprint remained. Not in orders or ranks, but in the people who had changed because of one quiet revelation. Raven stood on the range that morning, posture steady, shots measured. No rush, no desperation. She had stopped trying to prove something and started learning instead. Ivory watched from a distance unseen and felt something loosen inside her chest. General Silas sat in his office, reading reports he no longer needed to read. He had already made his choice. When the system offered him silence in exchange for convenience, he refused it. Some debts didn't expire. Some truths deserved daylight. Caleb visited his mother's grave for the first time in years. He didn't talk much. He didn't have to. The weight he'd carried since childhood felt lighter now, not gone but understood. Iris lived off-grid again, but not hiding this time. She kept bees, wrote letters she never sent, laughed more than she used to. Survival had changed shape for her. It wasn't just escape anymore. It was presence. And Ivory. Ivory stood at the edge of a field as the sun climbed higher. She wasn't waiting for orders. She wasn't scanning for threats. She was simply there. For the first time, that felt enough. She thought of the inspection room, the laughter, the way dignity had been mistaken for weakness. How easily people confuse noise with strength, speed with skill, cruelty with leadership. She had worn silence like armor for so long she forgot it could be set down. A young soldier jogged past her, breath uneven, eyes focused on the finish line. Ivory watched, recognizing the hunger, the fear, the hope. She almost said something. Advice, maybe, a warning. Instead, she let the moment pass. Not every lesson needs a voice. Later that evening, she opened the small box she'd carried from place to place for years. Inside were fragments of a life no one had known how to categorize. A folded photograph, a patch with worn stitching, the challenge coin, smooth from too many hands. She placed them back gently. Some things weren't meant to be displayed. They were meant to be honored quietly. As night settled, Ivory sat on the porch of a modest house that didn't belong to a mission or a cover story. The lights inside were warm, real. She listened to insects hum, to distant traffic, to the ordinary music of a world that kept going. She realized then that redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about choosing to stay. Choosing to live in a world that didn't need her violence but could still use her presence, her patience, her understanding of cost. The ghosts didn't leave entirely. They never do. But they softened, took their seats instead of standing guard, became memories rather than commands. Ivory closed her eyes and breathed. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't raise a hand or a weapon or a voice. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And for the first time since Iraq, she let herself believe that was enough.